Okay. So,
Sapan is fine. Sapan? Sapan?
His mic is not working, sir. His mic is not working.
Somebody ask, give him a call on his cell. Just ask him. And Anirudh, I would request you would have to start it again.
okay. Because that's all right. I'll share the.
Yes, he has said that he started recording it. It's fine
Okay.
now.
Yeah, Anirudh, you can start from the scratch. Thank you.
Sure. So the purpose of this talk is to focus on the IBC and just give a brief introduction to the IBC and the law that has evolved around the IBC. There are two parts to the IBC. One deals with the insolvency of companies, which is the corporate insolvency resolution process. The other deals with the insolvency and bankruptcy of individuals, which is the individual insolvency resolution process. Today in the talk, I'm going to focus on the company side of the IBC and not the individual side of the IBC. The individual side of the IBC, given that the IBC was notified in 2016, has been notified only recently in December 2020. But like I said, since that's a different sort of chapter in the IBC, I wouldn't want to focus on that. Now, insofar as the IBC deals with companies, it replaces provisions in the Companies Act, the earlier Companies Act 1956, as well as certain provisions in the 2013 Companies Act, which dealt with winding up of companies and liquidation of companies. With the introduction of the IBC, all of those provisions have now been taken off the statute book, and insolvency and liquidation of companies is dealt with only by the IBC. So in that sense, it's a subset of the earlier company law, but it is not just a replacement of that law, it is a new law in itself. And as we go through the provisions of the IBC and the scheme of the IBC, you'd realize that while you may be familiar with what the earlier winding up law said, it has limited applicability in the context of the IBC. Now, just to take you through the first slide, the IBC was notified on 28th May 2016. The code amends, consolidates the law relating to reorganization and insolvency of companies, LLPs, partnerships, corporate persons, and individuals. Now, like I said, individuals is something which we won't be dealing with. It's a separate area of law. It's in a separate chapter in the IBC and has been introduced only recently. So there is not that much law on it. Plus, it's different from the insolvency, which the law of insolvency relating to companies and similar entities. Now, the Supreme Court in Innoventive, it's one of the leading judgments of the Supreme Court on the IBC. One of the first judgments on the IBC has dealt with the scheme of the IBC, which is to say that the scheme is to divest the erstwhile management of its powers and vest it in a professional agency so that the business of the corporate body can be continued as a going concern until a resolution plan is drawn up. In which case, the management is handed over to the resolution applicant. So, just to understand the scheme of the IBC, there are a few definitions, and in fact, to even understand what the Supreme Court has said, it's important to understand some of the key definitions of which underpin this law. First is the corporate debtor. The corporate debtor really is the company or the LLP or the corporate person which undergoes the insolvency. So the corporate debtor is the person on whom or with respect to which the insolvency resolution process starts or takes place. A default is defined as a non-payment of debt. Default really is the trigger for the IBC only when a corporate debtor has committed a default, which is defined as a non-payment of debt when it has become due and payable. Can the IBC be triggered? I'll take you through that. Financial creditor, financial debt, and operational creditor, operational debt are important terms. Under the IBC, there are two types of creditors, and they have different rights and obligations in terms of the schemes of the Act. One are financial creditors. So financial creditors would include creditors like banks, NBFCs, basically people who've lent money to the corporate debtor, or as financial debt is defined, where they've given a debt to the corporate debtor, which is disbursed against consideration for the time value of money. So for instance, when a term loan is taken from a bank or an NBFC, that's a financial debt, and the bank or the NBFC becomes a financial creditor. An operational debt or operational creditor is to be distinguished from a financial creditor and financial debt. An operational creditor is a person who deals with the company as a part of its operation. So, for instance, when a company buys goods or services from third parties, the company owes money to that third party for the goods and services. That the amount which is owed is called the operational debt, and the person to whom the money is owed is called the operational creditor. So, for instance, Maruti has OEM suppliers. Maruti may buy engines or tanks or whatever from these OEM suppliers. These OEM suppliers are the operational creditors of Maruti, Maruti being the corporate debtor, and the amount which is owed by Maruti to these persons is called the operational debt. The next slide. The ecosystem of the code involves four main parts or four main personalities. The first is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, which is the IBBI. The IBBI is a new regulatory authority which has been created pursuant to the IBC. The aims and objectives and the powers of the IBBI are to regulate the ecosystem of in and around the IBC. So IBBI frames rules, regulations under the IBC. Various insolvency professionals who are whose designation also has been created now by the IBC for the first time are regulated by the IBBI. The adjudicating authority under the code is the NCLT. So the existing NCLTs who've been created under the Companies Act 2013 and who've derived powers from the earlier CLB created under the Companies Act 1956 have been given additional powers under the IBC to the extent they are defined as adjudicating authorities under the IBC. So now with the introduction of the IBC, NCLTs deal both with Companies Act cases as well as IBC cases. And information utility is somebody is also a entity which has been created under the Act. Basically, an information utility stores information about various debts which have been given by the banks and NBFCs. In fact, some of you may have received emails from one information utility was formed earlier last year, and some of you may have received emails from that information utility if you have a loan from a bank, etc., etc. So basically, an information utility is a aggregator of information relating to various debts around the country. And the insolvency professionals and the insolvency professional agency, basically these are the professionals who are tasked with running the IBC process or running the insolvency resolution process under the IBC. They are a separate class of professionals. So a lawyer or a chartered accountant or a CS can give an exam to qualify as an insolvency professional. And once you are qualified to be an insolvency professional, you can then act as an insolvency professional under the IBC. Now, the most important aspect of the IBC is starting the process. How does the insolvency resolution process start under the IBC? Now, some of you who may be familiar with the earlier Companies Act would know that winding up could be started by a creditor to whom a debt was owed. The Companies Act did not make a distinction between a debtor depending on whether that a distinction between creditors depending on whether that creditor was a financial creditor or an operation creditor. Any creditor whom money was owed could initiate winding up. And also there was a provision for shareholders winding up. Now, under the IBC, there are different persons who can initiate the process. A financial creditor can initiate the process. The initiation is slightly different from that of an operational creditor who is also allowed to initiate the process under Section 9. And the corporate debtor itself can initiate the process. So, three persons can initiate a insolvency resolution process in respect of a company. One is a financial creditor of a company, so say a bank or a or a financial institution which has lent money to a company can initiate corporate insolvency resolution process of that company to an operational creditor, being meaning thereby a person which has supplied goods or services on credit to a company. If that person is not paid and there is default, then that operational creditor can initiate the CIRP. And number three, the just a minute. Hello.
Anirudh, slightly closer to the mic.
Okay. Number three, the corporate debtor itself can initiate the CIRP process, which is the company itself, if it wants to undergo resolution, can initiate the process. So, just to give you some examples, I'm sure you would have read about this. The insolvency of Aircel was initiated, and the Aircel group of companies, the mobile service provider, that was initiated by the corporate debtor by Aircel itself. That's so. Therefore, that's an insolvency initiated under Section 10. Most of the big insolvencies that you've heard about, Bhushan Steels, Monetis Pat, Videocon, these were initiated by financial creditors, by the banks under Section 7. Operation creditors also have the right to initiate insolvency. Now, after the COVID-19, the pecuniary amount which entitles a person to initiate insolvency has been increased to 1 crore. Earlier it was 1 lakh. Also, if you are an operational creditor, you need to make a demand notice. You need to send a demand notice prior to making an application. That demand notice is not necessary where you are a financial creditor. So a bank, if it wants to initiate insolvency against a company, can initiate the insolvency without sending the notice. The bank only needs to file an application. Of course, the bank will have to show that it's lent money and there has been a default, and an opportunity would be given to the corporate debtor to resist it. But there is no requirement for a prior legal notice by the bank to initiate the insolvency. On the other hand, for an operational creditor, the understanding in the law is there has to be a notice, which is a precondition for you to approach the adjudicating authority, that is the NCLT, to initiate the insolvency. Now, the adjudicating authority will admit the application and initiate the CIRP, which is the corporate insolvency resolution process, if the application is complete, default has occurred, and there is a no payment of the operational debt in case of the OC, and no notice of dispute has been received by the OC in case of an OC. Now that's important. In the case of an operation creditor, when an operation creditor wants to initiate the insolvency resolution process, if there is a dispute on the amount that is owed to the operation.
Sorry to bother you. Could you just come closer to the mic, because large number of lawyers are sending me a text that your audibility is not to that level. I felt though as it was only in my case.
Okay, sure. Can you hear me now? Is this better?
If anybody has a problem of hearing, just he can put it on the chat box. Rest it's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear this? Is this better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. So, like I was saying, there is a different scheme under the Act between financial creditors and operational creditors. A financial creditor does not need to send a legal notice to start the CIRP process. An operational creditor has to send a notice to start the CIRP process. So a notice is it's a statutory notice under Section 8. So most of you would be familiar with the concept of sending legal notices under the Negotiable Instruments Act. Even under the old Companies Act, notices were required to be sent for initiation of winding up. A potential defense for the initiation of CIRP in the case of an operational creditor is that there is a dispute with regard to the operational debt. So for instance, if an operation creditor being a supplier has supplied goods or services to the company, but there is a dispute as regards the quality of those goods or services or the amount which is due, then that's a good enough defense, and the NCLT will not trigger the CIRP process. So coming to the defenses, in the case of financial creditors, the defenses, the potential defenses which are available are very less. So when a bank has initiated the CIRP, really the only defense is that one is that the application is incomplete, but that's really a curable defect. So for instance, the application has not been properly signed or the wakalatnama has not been properly notarized, things like that. But those really are very weak defenses. The only sort of big defense available in such a case is to say that the debt is barred by limitation, or that there is no default. So for instance, under the terms of your loan agreement, the default that has been claimed by the bank is really not yet occurred. Then perhaps a defense can be made. Otherwise, really, it's very difficult in the case of financial creditors to defend the initiation of a CIRP. In the case of OCs, which is the operation creditors, apart from the defenses which are available also in the case of financial creditors, the additional defense which is available is the existence of a dispute, which has been defined by the Supreme Court in Mobilox to mean that there must be prior to the demand notice. So once a demand notice is given by the operation creditor, it has to be shown that prior to the demand notice, there is a dispute between the parties as regards the amounts due. It should be a plausible contention, and it should not be spurious, hypothetical, or illusory. So,
Anirudh, Niharika has put forth one question. It's
Yes.
If you want, you can do it right now at a subsequent point of time. How does one prove that a debt is disputed in a Section 9 application?
Right. So, so for you to show that the debt is disputed, you need to provide some contemporaneous correspondence at a time prior to the demand notice and at the time that services were rendered. So, for instance, your demand notice is issued today and services were rendered last year. You need to show that last year, when the services were rendered, you disputed that the services were not up to the standard or not up to the quality, or there were some further losses which had happened, etc. So just to give you a real example, in one case, a fairly large automotive company had bought steel from a steel supplier that was, I mean, several crores were due to that steel supplier for the purchase of steel, and disputes arose between the parties as to the quality of the steel. The automotive company said that the steel should be of X quality, and it was not of that quality, and that was recorded in writing. After a certain point of time, when payments were not made by the company, the steel supplier initiated the CIRP process and sent a legal notice, a demand notice under Section 8, to which the response of the automotive company was that, see, the quality of the steel was not up to the mark, we've rejected the steel. And therefore there is a dispute between the parties, and that was upheld by the NCLT, and the CIRP process was rejected, or the Section 9 application was rejected by the NCLT in such circumstances. So really it depends on the facts of each case, whether you are able to show a dispute or not. The Supreme Court has said that it should be a plausible dispute. It should not be something which is hypothetical or illusory, and various judgments of the NCLT and NCLAT have taken the view that the dispute should be prior to the demand notice. So you cannot manufacture a dispute after you've received the demand notice. So if there is really no dispute prior to the demand notice, after the demand notice, you really can't make up a stand, etc., etc. In that case, you're better off paying the amount than risking your company go into
His mic is mute.
Yeah, Anirudh.
Yeah. So what happens once? So what happens once the CIRP is initiated? Now that's very interesting.
Since you were muted for 1 minute, just repeat that.
Okay. So there are two possibilities. Once an application is made to the NCLT, either the application is accepted and therefore the CIRP of the company starts, or the application is rejected, in which case the business of the company is back to normal and it continues doing what it has always been doing. But what happens once the CIRP starts or the NCLT accepts either the petition of a financial creditor or an operation creditor or of the company itself? The first thing which happens is, the moment the petition is accepted, a moratorium starts. What do you mean by a moratorium? Moratorium is defined under section 14. A moratorium effectively means that no legal process can be initiated against the company by anybody to recover monies or any other legal process. None of it can be initiated. So institution of suits are barred, alienation, encumbrance of properties are barred, all recoveries are barred, etc., etc. So a moratorium effectively means that the company has a legal umbrella. Nobody can touch the company during the time the moratorium is ongoing. Now, a lot of very interesting issues have come about. What happens to the rights of secured creditors? What happens to ongoing mortgages? What happens to lease deeds, etc., etc. Now, these are technical issues. There are various judgments of the courts on this, and this talk really is not long enough that we can go into the nitty-gritties of this. Just take it that once the moratorium is initiated, that moratorium ensures that no legal process can be initiated against the company. The second thing which happens once a
before going further, I have just 3 questions on the board on the chat. Otherwise, we would be taking against the time. One,
Sure.
Mr. RK is asking if the notice is sent right after the transaction. I didn't have the time to raise a dispute. How to go about it?
There must also be a default. So it can't be that just soon after the transaction, the monies have become due. There has to be a default, and for you to show the default, there has to be some correspondence between the parties. You can always say that the supplies have been made only now, and in terms of our understanding, there is no default. So that's one available defense if a notice is sent to you right after the transaction. You can also show a dispute in that case and legitimately take the ground that since the CIR, since the notice has been sent to me right after the transaction, I didn't have any occasion to raise a dispute. But that's an interesting point. I don't think, to my knowledge, any such case has arisen where right after the transaction, somebody's approached the NCLT or sent a demand notice. You also need to appreciate, for a person to approach court under the IBC, there has to be a breakdown of business relations. In cases of companies, that doesn't happen overnight. There is usually a long process and a long time period of follow-ups, chase-ups, etc., which are involved. So in practice, that's unlikely to happen. Which are the other questions?
Anirudh, you slightly again have to come towards the mic, and Niharika wants to talk to you directly. Niharika, you can unmute yourself and speak. Niharika.
Sir, good evening, sir. So it was regarding the previous question. However, that has been addressed. I had asked a question previously where you were addressing regarding if there is a time limit. How does one prove that a debt is disputed? So, sir, in NCLT proceedings, how can one prove a document? And if there is a correspondence, if there are emails showing the debt is disputed, would that be admitted by the court in NCLT proceedings?
Okay, Niharika, you will also have to come nearer to the mic.
Yes. No, that's a good question, Niharika. I've heard you. It's not a civil process, so you don't need to prove a document in the NCLT with the rigors of how you would want to prove the document in a civil court. So, for instance, with emails, you're not required to put in a 65A or B certificate. Having said that, all documents have to be attested and verified by the party or by a person who would claim the genuineness of those documents. So tomorrow, if you've put on record a false affidavit, then of course you open yourself to prosecution for that. But the NCLT, I mean, as far as evidence is concerned, it's really a summary procedure. So you don't need to prove documents with the strict figures of the evidence.
Okay. And so continuing to this, in this query only, I wanted to ask, in case I am not able to reply to the Section 8 notice, and I take an objection in my reply in the Section 9 application, and I take it as those documents I produce at that stage, would they be admitted? if I don't revert to the legal notice instead and I file a reply?
So, okay, so that's also an interesting question. It's not advisable at all that you don't reply to a Section 8 notice. You have a time period of 10 days to
That's
reply
very
to that
less,
notice.
actually, very short.
That's a very short time period, but that's, I mean, this is a law which sort of is commended
Right.
for its speed.
Yes.
So, given that, I mean, if it really doesn't take that long for a company to say whether the amount is due or not due, right? Or whether it's disputed or not. That shouldn't take longer than 10 days, or at least that's the legislative thinking.
Next
Anirudh,
question
if
is
you-
from Siddhi.
Right to
Anirudh,
it.
if you just permit me, I can just pitch in something very important for everyone. In
Sure.
fact, even WhatsApp communication and SMSs are also admissible. I, in fact, won a case on the basis of merely WhatsApp communication between the parties, and I was able to tell them that it's a valid dispute. NCLT Chandigarh dismissed the insolvency petition, and which was upheld by NCLT. I merely filed an affidavit, and the WhatsApp communication that was admissible in evidence over here.
Siddhi Bansal is also wanting to ask a question. Siddhi, you can come on the board. Siddhi, the question is effective moratorium on the ongoing DRT proceedings.
Sure. So DRT process would completely stop. I mean, it's very clear if you look at the definition in section 14. A DRT proceeding would be initiated typically by a bank under the RDDB Act, or under the SARFACI Act by a financial institution. Either way, it would be stopped given the terms of the moratorium. The banks or financial institutions are required to participate in the CIRP process, and so long as the CIRP process is continuing, no other court can have jurisdiction over the debts of the company or over the affairs of the company other than the NCLT. So on that, the law is very.
What about the personal guarantee that we give in those proceedings while securing loans, sir?
So that's a doubtful issue. Initially, for people who are familiar with this law would know that there was a judgment of the Allahabad High Court.
Yes, sir.
In fact,
Yes, sir. There was a subsequent judgment also that said that it could not be stayed. Yes, sir.
That's right. That's right. So we had in fact appeared in the Allahabad High Court judgment. I was involved for the personal guarantor there, and the Allahabad High Court judgment said that the moratorium under Section 14 would extend to personal guarantors as well. So in that case, the facts are very interesting. There, the DRT, the proceedings were going on in the DRT against LML under the RDDB Act, Recovery of Debts Due to Banks Act, against LML and the personal guarantors of LML. LML initiated CIRP under Section 10, which was admitted, and a moratorium was issued. Because of the moratorium, the proceedings in the DRT against LML were stayed. But the DRT said that the proceedings against the guarantors must go on because they have a coextensive liability.
Yes, sir.
An independent liability, and the moratorium does not extend to the guarantors. That was challenged in the Allahabad High Court. The Allahabad High Court stayed the process against the guarantors as well. They said the liability is coextensive, and really everything must be before the NCLT, and you can't have a parallel processes going on before the DRT and before the NCLT.
We have only
regarding
one
moratorium.
question. Vishal, I'm just saying one thing. Singh Sahab, I think we are reworking on the model. Let Anirudh complete it, and then thereafter, in the end of the 15 minutes, we will have the question answer session.
Okay.
Otherwise, the entire tempo will go. So I apologize for the entire change of process because I'm receiving the messages that the entire theme goes to the background.
No issue.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, no problem. So just to finish the question against after that judgment of the Allahabad High Court, that CIRP can go on against personal guarantors as well. Now the chapter in the IBC dealing with personal insolvency has also been brought into force. So it's still a gray area how far how far a moratorium would extend, or what happens in cases where the personal insolvency is also initiated. one is not really very sure. But as far as the effect of Section 14 is concerned, it's very clear that it would not extend to personal guarantors, but it would certainly extend to all proceedings against the company, including in the DRT. Now, now moving on from there, the first effect, of course, of the CRP is the moratorium, like we've discussed. The second effect is that the board of directors of the company stands suspended, and the powers and functions of the board of directors are exercised by a person called as the interim resolution professional, or an IRP. Now this IRP is appointed by the NCLT initially, once the NCLT admits the insolvency petition. The IRP, as the name suggests, is only an interim resolution professional. The IRP has to be confirmed to become a resolution professional or an RP by a body called as the COC. COC being the Committee of Creditors. Now, really, the COC is the driving force behind the corporate insolvency resolution process after it is admitted. So the NCLT then takes a backseat. They appoint an IRP to manage the affairs of the corporate debtor. The understanding is that the corporate debtor would remain an ongoing concern. So once a insolvency petition is admitted, your board of directors are suspended, the IRP is appointed, the company remains an ongoing concern, and the IRP has the duty to constitute a COC. So it will invite claims and constitute a committee of creditors. Now the COC consists of all the financial creditors of the corporate debtor. So all the banks, NBFCs, and other persons who've lent money to the corporate debtor have a right to be a part of the COC. Operational creditors do not have a right to be a part of the COC. So persons who provided goods or services are not members of the COC. The COC in its first meeting has to confirm the IRP. So they confirm the interim resolution professional to be the resolution professional. If they don't confirm him, they can appoint somebody else as a resolution professional. These are all private parties. You would appreciate the distinction from the earlier time under the Companies Act, the winding up provisions, where the winding up or the liquidation used to happen under the auspices of the official office of the official liquidator, which was attached to each high court and came under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Unlike that, in the IBC, all of these persons, the resolution professionals, interim resolution professionals, are not affiliated to the government. They are all private persons, and they are remunerated for their services by the COC. Of course, the money comes from the corporate debtor. Let's come to the Committee of Creditors. The IRP has to give an advertisement in the papers, invite the claims from operational creditors and financial creditors. So anybody who's dealt with the company and has any amounts to be taken from the company, or who's a creditor of the company, would then send all of their claims to the IRP. There's a timeline in this entire process. Once you send your claims to the IRP or the RP, they would collate the claims, form the COC, and make a list of those claims. The COC meets to take decisions on the functioning of the RP or the IRP, and all major decisions which relate to the functioning of the corporate debtor. The timelines of the CIRP are very important. So if you just have a look at this slide, the timeline, the process runs like this. If on day T, the CIRP is commenced, which means the NCLT has admitted an insolvency petition. On that date itself, they would appoint an IRP and they would declare the moratorium, which we discussed about earlier. On T+21, so within 21 days, the IRP has to make a public announcement inviting claims, and also has to verify those claims. In 9 days, so T+21 and T+30, between that time, they have to constitute the COC and they have to ensure the first meeting of the COC happens. In the first meeting of the COC, you would see it says appointment of the RP. So therefore, the IRP has to be confirmed as the RP, or any other person has to be appointed as the RP. In T+90, there is the invitation of EOI and submission of EOI. EOI is an expression of interest. So the way the process works is, once an IRP is appointed and the COC takes over the functioning of the company, the idea is to change the management of the company. So you can't have the same management of the company anymore. There is a provision in the IBC called Section 29A, which was brought into the statute book after the insolvency in SR, where the Ruyas wanted to take over SR and submit a resolution plan. And they brought in 29A to ensure that promoters and parties affiliated to the existing promoters would not be able to take over the company or submit a resolution plan. So in T+90, the RP invites an expression of interest from potential resolution applicants, meaning thereby persons who are interested in taking over the management of the company and not being the promoters of the company, because they are ineligible to take over the company after the company goes into the CIRP process. In T+135, there has to be a provisional list of RAs, which is the resolution applicants, issue of RFPs, and receipt of resolution plans. So RFP is a request for proposals, and resolution plans would be invited. These resolution plans have to be accepted by the COC. So there is a voting which happens in the COC. So depending on the interest shown by private persons on the companies, resolution plans are invited and resolution plans are submitted for approval to the COC. Now, again, there are two possibilities. Either a resolution plan is accepted by the COC by the requisite majority, 66%, or a resolution plan is rejected. In the event a resolution plan is accepted by the COC, it goes to the NCLT, and the NCLT would then take a call on whether the resolution plan satisfies the conditions of law or not. If it does satisfy all the conditions, the NCLT would approve the resolution plan, and it then becomes binding. The new management takes over. If the resolution plan is rejected, or if there is no resolution plan, or if the NCLT rejects the resolution plan, in all of these cases, the legislative thinking is there's really no hope for revival of the company, and the company goes into a process called as liquidation, which means that the company, it sort of effectively constitutes a death of the company. The assets of the company have to be distributed between the creditors, and the company sort of closes. So that's in just how it works. Who can submit resolution plan? Section 29A, what I spoke about earlier. There are disqualifications on persons who are not eligible to be a resolution applicant. Like I said, 29A was brought into the statute books to remedy a particular problem, which is that of persons who are undesirable to take over the company after they've run the company to the ground and got in the initiation of the CIRP process. So ex-promoters, willful defaulters, undischarged insolvents, all of these persons are barred from submitting a resolution plan. The resolution plan, resolution applicant may submit a resolution plan to the RP prepared on the basis of the IM being the information memorandum. So like I said, one of the most important jobs for the RP is to collate all the data of the company and prepare an information memorandum. It's effectively like a brochure for anybody who wants to give a resolution plan or submit a resolution plan for the company. So the entire processes of the company, the operations of the company, the debts and liabilities of the company, all of that is crystallized in the information memorandum. Resolution applicants are allowed upon giving certain, upon signing certain confidentiality documents and providing earnest money, etc., to access the IM and then prepare to give a resolution plan. Now, the requirements of a resolution plan are given in section 30 subsection 2. It has to conform to all the provisions of law. It has to conform to the requirements of IBBI. It has to provide for the management of affairs of the corporate debtor. There has to be a process for the implementation and supervision of the resolution plan. There has to be a proposal given as to how it is to be funded. What haircuts are being offered to the creditors. So for instance, haircuts offered to operational creditors under the resolution plan cannot be less than the liquidation value of the plan, etc., etc. So these are the various requirements listed down in section 30 subsection 2. The resolution plan has to conform with all of these requirements. And the NCLT, while approving the resolution plan, also has to see that each of these requirements have been fulfilled in the resolution plan. Now, if the COC has passed the resolution plan, it goes to the adjudicating authority. The adjudicating authority then has to see that the resolution plan meets all the requirements of law. If it does, it approves it. And the resolution plan, this is very important. Section 31 really is the heart of the CIRP process. The resolution plan then becomes binding on the corporate debtor, the employees, the members, the creditors, the guarantors, and all other stakeholders. So that document, which is submitted as the plan to take over the company, binds everyone by operation of law once it's accepted by the adjudicating authority. And it overrides all other statutory limitations, if any. And once the resolution plan is accepted, the new management takes over the company, the moratorium ceases to have effect, and there is a change in ownership of the company, and the company then proceeds under its new owners as per the resolution plan. If the resolution plan is not accepted, or the COC rejects the resolution plan, or there is no interest in the revival of the company and no resolution plan is submitted, then the company really goes into liquidation, because there is nobody else who's willing to take over the management of the company, or who can take over the management of the company. In such cases, the resolution professional then, the role of the resolution professional is changed. He becomes a liquidator of the company, and the COC is disbanded. So there is no requirement for a committee of creditors anymore. The liquidator, in his the professional in his role as the liquidator, then is answerable to the adjudicating authority and not to any particular creditors of the company. Now, once the company goes into liquidation, there is another moratorium which is instituted, which is the liquidation moratorium. It's different from the CIRP moratorium under Section 14. It ensures that the purpose of this moratorium is to ensure that the liquidation process goes on smoothly and the affairs of the company are wound up and closed down in the most effective manner possible. The resolution professional usually becomes the liquidator, or the NCLT can appoint somebody else as the liquidator. The liquidator again invites claims, consolidates and verifies claims. It either rejects or admits claims. Against the orders of the liquidator, appeals are provided directly to the NCLT. The liquidator values claims, distributes the proceeds in terms of the priority waterfall, which is laid down in Section 53, which I'll come to next. And the idea is to dissolve the corporate debtor. There is a time period provided even for liquidation, which is 1 year. And if liquidation exceeds 1 year, then the liquidator is required to make an application to the adjudicating authority, providing the reasons for not complying with the timeline and get an extension. This is the priority waterfall. There are 8 classes when the company is liquidated. First is IRP, and from the pool of money, problems only arise when the money available is insufficient for the creditors of the company, and the priority waterfall has been provided in law to ensure that when the resources are limited, they are divided in the most equitable or the most just manner. So the first bite at the apple is taken by the IRP for the IRP and liquidation costs. The second is debts owed to secured creditors, workmen, etc. Third goes to wages, unpaid dues to other employees, then financial debts of unsecured creditors, then amounts due to the government, then other remaining dues, and equity So at any point of time in the waterfall, if the money dries up, the person standing behind in the waterfall at IBC, which we've spoken about. And
Anirudh, the mic is not functioning properly.
Sure. I think this was the insolvency. This is just a slide on the insolvency regime prior to the IBC, which which I've already spoken about, so I don't need to go through that. I think that's my presentation. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Sahil Gambhir has posed a question. Harveet Singh Sehgal asks, can revenue authorities initiate searches and raids during moratorium as there are not in the nature of legal proceedings?
So I'm not very sure about that, whether they can initiate searches or raids. I don't see any reason why they cannot initiate a search or a raid just to discover material or to get hold of material which otherwise is not available to them. But legal process cannot be initiated. So after the search or a raid, if they want to do an assessment or a reassessment, etc., or open up the accounts of the company, that is not permissible under the IBC. And after a resolution plan is accepted, their raids or searches become meaningless because they are also bound by the outcome of the resolution plan. You'd appreciate under the IBC, the government doesn't have a special role or priority. So
Anirudh, it's becoming embarrassing. Time and again, your audibility is becomes very poor. Anirudh.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
You would have to, you would have to repeat what you have said.
Okay. So I'm just saying that the IBC does not have any special role or special place, no special privileges being given to the government under the IBC. So revenue authorities are also bound by the IBC process as ordinary creditors, just like anybody else. So the fact that a search or a raid is conducted, I don't think that's prohibited under the moratorium. But what is prohibited is the assessment or the reassessments which follow after a search or a raid.
Mr. IP Singh wanted to ask you a question. He can ask you directly.
Yes. My question is, once the RP takes over the possession of the secured asset, it's a building which is under tenancy. What is the liability of the RP toward the landlord to pay the rent?
Sir, there have been some difficulties as far as liability of RPs to landlords is concerned. Because there is a moratorium, the landlord cannot initiate any legal process to either throw the company out or to get its rent. But usually courts, when they order a moratorium, they give directions to the RPs to ensure the company remains a going concern. And therefore, if a landlord has a problem, it can always come to court and say that by defaulting on its rent, it's not complying with its directions under the order, and seek some directions there. But beyond the point, there's really not that much that a landlord can do if its tenant goes into the CRP process.
Any judgment where NCLT or NCLT has directed the RP to pay rent?
There are some judgments, sir. I'll share those with you. I think there's one judgment of the Chandigarh NCLT, if I remember correctly, called James Hotel, where they directed that. There is also a series of judgments of the Bombay NCLT where they directed to pay rent.
Okay. You please tell Mr. Chaturata.
In James Hotel, with due respect, there is no such direction.
Mr. Sachdeva wanted to ask a certain question, and he also wanted to clarify. Mr. Sachdeva, you can come straight away.
I am saying that in the James Hotel case, because I was also representing one of the secured creditors in the NCLT. In James Hotel, there is no such direction to payment for the payment of rent to any landlord, because there was no landlord tenant as such.
I may be mistaken, but I remember there was something to that effect, but I may be mistaken. But there are certainly series of judgments of the Bombay NCLT where this.
Anyway.
Can you please share with that, please?
Advocate Prince Goel also wants to come.
I have one question.
Yeah, Mr.
There are proceedings already going on the PML under PMLA, initiated by ED.
Yes.
And the CRIP proceedings are initiated before the NCLT.
Yes, sir.
And petition is admitted, IRP is appointed.
Yes, sir.
What would be the status of the assets in the hand of RP which are already attached with the under PMLA with the ED.
Right. So this issue arose
because under section 18, if I am, because this is a very still a doubtful preposition, because under section 18, RP can have a control only over those assets which belong to the company.
That's right, sir.
The status of those assets has come under cloud because of attachment by the ED, and that is yet to be adjudicated by the adjudicating authority under PMLA.
You are right, sir. This is a very tricky issue. It arose in Bhushan Steel, but there it arose in a different way. There the attachment by the ED was to happen after the initiation of the CIRP, and the NCLAT took the view that that's not permissible. Because once
I'm saying it is prior to this. If the attachment is prior
to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there is a judgment on this. What happens? What are the powers of the RP in relation to assets which have been attached prior to the issuance of the moratorium and admission of the process?
Because Delhi High Court has given one judgment on this issue, which says that a harmonious construction has to be done between the two acts. So Honorable Delhi High Court also did not make it very, very clear. So it has been left to the wisdom of the NCLTs as of now. So this is a very tricky question. One of the concerns is already under the ED, and how RP can even touch those assets, because both are special acts.
You are right, sir. This is an important issue. It remains for a court to adjudicate on this.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Anirudh Dhaval Bhandari is asking a question. Whereupon initiation of CIRP, NCLAT reverses the judgment of NCLT. Who shall bear the expenses incurred by the IRP for the work that has been done?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. It happens every day. The initial expense, of course, is borne by the person who gets the CIRP initiated, because that's it's to that person that the IRP or the RP would look at once he or she is appointed. But usually, once the appeal is allowed by the NCLAT, in the judgment itself, the NCLAT makes it clear who is to bear the expenses of the IRP, because the IRP is always a party in the appeal before the NCLAT. The corporate debtor, as you know, can exist only through the RP. So anytime an appeal is filed by anybody aggrieved by an order initiating IRP, CIRP, they have to make the IRP a party. So at that point of time, the NCLAT usually directs either the creditor to take the bill or the corporate debtor to take the bill. It really depends upon the facts and circumstances of the case. But this question almost always arises whenever an appeal is being allowed.
Anirudh, I have one question, Vikasji.
Go ahead.
This is again a very tricky situation. Resolution. It is in respect to the resolution applicant.
Yes, sir.
The resolution plan is submitted pursuant to the IM issued by the RP.
Yes, sir.
And on those bases, the entire calculations are submitted by the resolution applicant.
That's right, sir.
Subsequently, if it is found out that the IM is incomplete, IM is defective, regarding there are various encumbrances on the assets which are not disclosed in the IM, and there is a direct prejudice to the resolution applicant. What would be the status of the resolution applicant in such cases and at that stage?
Right. So that's an important question. It has already arisen in the case of Amtech Auto, in the NCLT level and the NCLAT level. If you'd be aware, there is a group called Liberty House.
Yes.
So Liberty House had submitted a lot of resolution plans in relation to ongoing insolvencies. Subsequently, after having submitted the resolution plan, after in fact some of those plans were even approved by the COC, they took the argument that the information memorandum was incomplete, or that we were not given the entire picture, or that there were issues which were not disclosed from the RP to us, and therefore our resolution plan, we should be allowed to back out from it. Now, as a matter of fact, there are a line of these judgments. As a matter of fact, the NCLT and the NCLAT found that their backing out was not based on any cogent material. So the information memorandum was perfectly in order. And therefore, their argument was rejected. They were not allowed to back out of the plan. But of course, if they didn't have the money, they couldn't. You can't force. You can't. I mean, and given that they
force
were
anybody.
Correct, and they were foreign. They were based out of India, so they couldn't be forced in that sense. But the NCLT did direct initiation of prosecution against them for wrongfully backing out of a resolution plan.
No, that was in that fact situation, sir. I am
That's right, sir.
talking
So
of a one fact situation where this is actually a situation that the RP either inadvertently or deliberately has left out some very, very important information which has got a direct bearing on the resolution of the company.
Sir, in that case, then perhaps one may need to look at general law, which is that that of either say misrepresentation or a mistake of fact, which is under the Contract Act.
No, sir, like under the Securitization Act also, when a property is put to auction by the authorized officer, he is mandated under Rule 8 to give the details of all the encumbrances on the property. And if the sale notice or the auction notice issued by the authorized officer is as vague as is various basis or no details of the encumbrances are given, then in those cases, auction purchaser who has given 25% of the earnest money deposit, he can approach to the court that, sorry, I'm not interested to buy a litigating property, kindly refund my money.
It is possible.
But in the NCLT, there is no such clarity.
There is no such clarity, sir, but it is certainly possible. One can argue that fraud vitiates everything, or that this is a case where parties are under mistakes of fact, or there is a misrepresentation. So certainly general provisions or general principles of law can be applied. But to the best of my knowledge, there is no such case where this has been found as a matter of fact.
Because, sir, just one line more and then it will be over to you. Because Section 55 of the Transfer of Property Act,
yes, sir,
also mandates that the clear title should be given, or the clear description of the title should be provided. 55(1)(a) to be more precise.
Yes,
and 55 at the end it says if any information is missing, it will amount to fraud. So in that situation, resolution applicant, in my view, should be permitted to back out. And if he is permitted to back out, and the RP is found to be acting mala fide, then the entire object would be defeated.
Correct, sir. You are, Sachdevaji, you are right. But it's the issue also is it's in fact more tricky than that. The question is at what point of time can a resolution applicant back out? Assuming the resolution plan is accepted, approved by the NCLT, the resolution applicant takes over the management of the company. Everybody is bound in terms of the law under Section 31 of the IBC now by that resolution plan. 1 year after that, the resolution applicant says, hold on.
That is mala fide on his part.
Sir, maybe it is true. You didn't give me this information which you should have. So the question is, it really depends upon the facts and circumstances of the case. And how far down in the process are we to allow the resolution applicant to back out from something like this?
Right, sir. This will be fact situations. We shall.
Thank you. Last 3 questions, and we will then wrap it off.
Sure.
Which have already been posed on the chat platform. One is by Mr. Arvind Rajotia. If any application is moved under Section 10, can FC request to the NCLT to admit the application and appoint any IRP/RP of his own choice instead of IRP to be appointed by the NCLT?
Right. So, I mean, of course, there's nothing which prevents a financial creditor from making that request. But even assuming there's nothing in the law which sort of gives that power to a financial creditor. But even assuming the NCLT does appoint a resolution applicant, a resolution professional, an interim resolution professional, the FC is always allowed, being part of the COC, to make a change and appoint somebody else as a resolution professional once the first COC meeting is held. So that may be a better stage to agitate that issue.
Mr. RK wants to ask a question directly. Mr. RK can come on the board. Mr. RK?
Yeah, hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I have 2 quick questions. One was with regards to an earlier question pointed out, which was with regards to a challenge to a resolution plan or an IM. Now, in case I'm an operational creditor and the insolvency has been initiated by a financial creditor, in that case, I am not a part of the CC. I'm not a part of the proceedings as well. And even the IM, the resolution plan, they're all confidential in nature. So how would I come to know, and how do I challenge if there is an information which has been provided for by the IRP or by the RP, which is not correct or which is against my interest? So how do I, and where do I challenge them? How do I come to know if something like that has happened?
So that's very difficult. As an operational creditor, your rights under the IBC are very, very limited. In fact, that's what led to the challenge to the constitutionality of the IBC. But the Supreme Court in Swiss Ribbon said that it's fine. It's for the legislature to make that distinction between the financial creditors and operational creditors.
No, so then what happens to the interest? Yeah,
no, sorry. But there are some safeguards in the process. Number one, as an operation creditor, you really are interested in your money. So the first safeguard is that once the IRP or the RP collates your claims, if your claim is not correct, then you have the right to challenge that collation and move the NCLT. Number two, if the resolution, whatever.
How would I know that the collation has been done wrongly? If I've given my all my claims and that has not been included or that has been wrongly included, how do I come to
the resolution professional usually uploads the collation of claims on the website. As per the regulations, they have to share that. That's available.
Okay.
So you get to know what are, and if your claims are incorrectly collated, then of course you can challenge that. The second sort of a safeguard provided to operation creditor under the law is that the resolution plan which is there has to provide the minimum liquidation value or the pro rata liquidation amount which is due to a resolution applicant. It cannot be less than the liquidation amount. So if the amount provided under a resolution plan for an operation creditor is less than the liquidation amount, then that's something which can be challenged by an operation creditor. In fact, it's a requirement of law. So the NCLT, neither the NCLT nor in fact even the resolution professional would allow a resolution plan like that to go forward.
Okay,
but
thank you.
Other than that, you're really it's a difficult situation in most cases for operation creditors.
Right. There was one more small question. Mm-hmm. This is a practical issue that in fact I had faced myself. So in an operational creditor, so there are these claims which are very the value which is very less in nature. For example, this is before the pecuniary value became of 1 crore.
Mr. RK, you will have to come nearer to the mic.
Yeah, so I'm saying earlier when the pecuniary value was say 1 lakh earlier, now it's become 1 crore. At that time, I had a client who had say an amount of rupees around 2 crores, and for him to initiate the insolvency, when the IRP is appointed, his fee itself was probably around 1.5 lakhs is what he sought at that stage. So at this stage, can he back out? Can he say that I do not wish to continue or I do not wish to pay the IRP that initial amount? So it's a practical issue. It's really something that I wanted to confirm from you.
No, that's very difficult. I mean, you can't really back out in that sense. You can refuse to pay the IRP, in which case the IRP would go to the NCLT.
Right.
Perhaps the NCLT may appoint somebody else. I'm not very sure.
I mean, in that case, can I be directed or can I be forced to pay up this amount is really what my question was.
It's possible. It's certainly possible for the NCLT to direct you to pay initially, and then you would have the right to be reimbursed from the COC later.
Of course. Right.
But somebody has to start the machinery, and for that, whatever costs are required has to be borne by somebody. If you approach court, then the responsibility is on you, and the NCLT can certainly direct you.
Yeah, but then the idea was then what if I say that the amount which has been asked for by the IRP to me is actually more than what my claim is? In that case, it becomes a very interesting situation.
Correct. It does, and especially in cases where, say, I've seen cases where some employees have initiated CRP process. being operation creditors, and the IRPs have raised huge bills. In those cases, you go to the NCLT. Practically, the way forward is you go to the NCLT, plead your inability, and the NCLT usually find some solution. They would either change the IRP or get an IRP to do it till so long as they are reimbursed from the COC.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Mr. Anirudh, we are through with the questions. Before I ask Vishal Agarwal to say a vote of thanks, I will just sum up in 3 words, 3 lines in my in this entire thing. We had always read about that the books are the best friends for anybody. But today, after hearing you, I have realized that the virtual platform can be still much better than the books. Because books is a one-sided affair. You read it, you don't have the aspiration, you don't know the feelings of somebody else, etc. Today, once we hear you, though we had been reading your books throughout, but today after hearing you, it's a much better enrichment experience. Looking on the videos, coming on a different platform, it's a different experience. I just asked Vishal to wrap it off in his own style, which has a different style of wrapping it off by his vote of thanks. And thanks a ton from all of us.
Thank you, Vikasji, and Anirudh, thank you very much. I'm already doing this work under IBC, but believe me, today's presentation was amazing. And coupled with the fact that you prepared this wonderful presentation, it actually gives us pointers.
Vishal, what I have been requesting to everybody, you'll have to come slightly closer to the mic.
I'm quite close to the mic. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now? Everybody
yes.
is not audible to that effect.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better.
So Anirudh, as I was just saying that just gone through this entire thing, and it was actually amazing to see it that you prepared a wonderful presentation and taken us through this. Also, it seems that I've actually read the entire book today with wonderful pointers given. In fact, I'd request you that if you could just share this presentation, it's really helpful for every one of us. And we are really thankful and I thank from all the members and participants over here for sparing so much time and apprising us about this act. And before I end, I must thank Vikas sir and Sarpanji also for taking such a wonderful initiative. It's really a wonderful insight into this entire law today, and of course, best utility of time as well. Thank you very much.
And before we part, just for the friends who are not linked in the group or on the Facebook, tomorrow we have a session from Dr. Balram Gupta and Madam Dr. Shruti Bedi. She will be on air at 11 o'clock. And as I have told you earlier in the earlier rounds, that Mr. P.S. Patwalia, Mr. Puneet Bali, and large number of persons have agreed. Anirudh's younger brother Aditya would be coming. Anirudh Krishnan from Madras, from AK Law Chambers. So we have large number of Justice Kanan, Justice M.M. Kumar. We are just coming across daily. We thought that it would be once in a week would be enough. There won't be large number of participants. But gradually, people are increasing. जैसे वो कहते हैं सचदेवा साहब कि भाई चले थे अकेले और कारवां बनता गया.
Sir, please do share the.
And the entire credit goes to Vikas and Sapan, and we all support you wholeheartedly in this mission. It's beneficial to all, one and all.
Please share the IDs and password for tomorrow's sessions as well.
I will post it in the group. If Vishal, you are on the group.
I have a special thanks to IP Singhji who has taken out the time to come.
Vishal, if you are on the group, that would be fine. Or you can check it out the Facebook.
Okay, I'll do that, sir.
Or you can like the Facebook page.
I'll do that, sir. I'll do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a ton.
Thank you. Really enjoying.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Vikas ji.
Nalin sir, ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੈ sir.
Thank you.